I'm Dr. Jillian Hartley from Arkansas Northeastern College. I'm a professor of history. I'm also serving on the advisory board for the National Cold War Center. And through that center, I was able to meet Gil Credeur. Gil is a person who served in the Air Force in the mid 1960s. And so he's going to share his story with us today. Gil, thank you for being here. Do I have your permission to record?
Of course, sure.
Great. I'd like to kind of get some background information. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, a little bit about your family growing up?
Sure. Jillian, I was born right at the very end of the Second World War um, into a French culture in southwestern Louisiana. Um, my parents were farmers, and by then, I think this is important. By the time I was born, my parents were 33 years of age. Um, and so they had had some time to mature and establish themselves as among the most productive farming families. Um, they worked hard, they worked smart, and they were very proactive about moving forward with opportunities that came to them.
Gil,
And
may I ask, what did they grow? What was their main
I'm
crop?
sorry,
Oh,
the cash crop.
okay.
Uh, I don't know. I'm gonna say it this way.
Okay.
The main crop was really producing our own food. Okay, from our perspective, that was our main function or crop, was producing most as much of our own food as we could. From the landowner's point of view, they were interested in the cash crop because that's how they got paid for letting us letting us have the use of the farm,
Yeah.
which included a house and everything else that went with that. By the way, so the cash crop was cotton, uh, uh, and I think it's important to note also that all of this growing was all hand labor. Um, very little machinery involved. Uh, so
Did you ever have to work out in the fields yourself as a kid?
uh, I did, Julian, but my parents were very strong
Mm.
on that. My parents' kids would not miss school to work on the farm, which was unusual for at that time. Uh, I had a lot of classmates who missed a lot of school.
Mm.
Um,
Sounds
there
like you
was,
have
there,
family.
I'm sorry.
It sounds like you have a very strong parental background and
Wow.
influence. And could you tell us a little bit about their heritage?
Julian, most of my ancestors that I know of were exiled from French Canada, Acadia, Nova Scotia, that area. Uh, they had been there about 100 years before the English, the British, moved in their military. And some chose to go to align with the British. Um, some chose to fight the British, and some just tolerated getting exiled, getting run away from that country. And so they left, my ancestors left Nova Scotia and settled over a period of time. They found their way to Southwest Louisiana, which was still very undeveloped. It was still very isolated, you know. Um, but what happened, one reason that Louisiana got chosen was because the French and the Spanish governments divided up that territory
Mhm.
at that time. Um, they were both very friendly to the French colonists um, because they shared a religion. Uh, languages were fairly closely aligned, and both of them were warring with the British.
Mhm.
And so, for all of those reasons, um, Southwestern Louisiana became the place where my ancestors moved to.
Wow.
Uh, and I'm the seventh generation in Louisiana in one family, and in the eighth generation of the other family, of my mother's family. And so, and there were farmers in Canada. And so they picked up that they started doing the same thing in Southwest Louisiana.
That's
Um,
amazing. When you talk
and
about,
by
when
the
you talk
time
about,
by the time I came along, Jillian, and long before I came along, the land grants that were so huge
Mhm.
had been subdivided into small farms. And so
Well, it sounds
people
like,
people either owned that land or they became sharecropping farmers.
well, and it sounds like you had the advantage of getting to go to school maybe more than some of the other children your age.
Absolutely right, right. I
But
did.
could you talk a little bit about just your school and your drive uh, to learn more and
Oh, my parents were not educated. Mama estimated that out of the 10 years that she was required to register for school, she estimated she had been in class about 3 of those 10 years.
um,
And my father never stepped into a classroom ever, ever. Yeah. Um, but both very intelligent and focused, and as I said, by the time I came along, they had matured, they had chances to mature a lot, uh, and uh, were just very, very focused on being proactive with the opportunities that we had. And one of those, Jillian, resulted in, by the time that I was in the fourth grade, I was in my fourth elementary school.
hmm,
Uh, Four different small communities, and each one had its own school system. Uh, and what I learned just from living and growing up with mom and daddy is that you have to do those three things. You have to work hard, you have to work smart, and you need to you need to take advantage of the opportunities to improve your life. And all of that played into wanting to learn more and wanting to have more education.
so did you play sports in school?
I did. In fact, my first option as a senior in high school uh, was to get a football scholarship because my family could not afford college for me. Um, and the scholarship was the way that I was going to pay for school. It was also going to get me a student deferment so that I was immune from the draft board for a period of time. But by December of that year, my senior year, the university notified me that I was not getting the scholarship. So I had to look at plan A and B, not plan A. Plan A had fallen through,
Mm.
but I had to look at plan B and C and D and so forth. Um, and because I was in that area where the big university is, um, every young guy who could afford to be there was. And so that left the draft pool pretty small, which made the ones of us that were in that pool, pretty highly uh, subject to being drafted.
Mhm.
And so because of that, and employers knew that too, and I couldn't even get a good job uh, because I was so draftable. And so, plan B didn't work, plan C didn't work. Um, but I discovered that I could defer my education. It would take that to to enlist and serve um, in the Air Force, and then use the educational benefits after that. Um, and at that time, Jillian, the maximum GI educational benefits were an academic month of credit, of money, in exchange for a month of active duty service,
Okay.
up to a maximum of 36 months. And so I calculated it all out, and I navigated the system, the Air Force system, um, to serve exactly 36 months on active duty. The Air Force released me. I came home and started school.
So can you tell me why the Air Force?
Oh, why the Air Force? Uh, the other branch that I considered was the Navy. Um, it was, I don't know that I had so much insight, but it turned out to be a wonderful match. Okay. Um, because the Air Force and I were just so compatible. They wanted the character and the traits that I had, and the Air Force operated the way that I wanted to operate.
And
And
just to clarify too, you weren't drafted. You enlisted.
listen, the recruiter did not call me; I called him.
Okay. It was your choice.
So, Jillian, after from January of that my senior year, uh, that's when I first contacted the recruiter, and he began a process of my going to his office to fill out forms, applications, to take tests, and over and over and over. And so at some point on one of those trips, I said, "Am I in the Air Force already?" He laughed. He said, "No." He said, "No." He said, "First of all, you have to graduate from high school, and as soon as you have done that, uh, and we have confirmation of it, um, within a month or so after that, I will have everything ready for you to enlist." And that's how it worked out. But no, I contacted the recruiter, Jillian, because that was part of my makeup is to be proactive.
Be on top of it. Well, where did you do your basic training? What?
Um, 4 days of processing in New Orleans,
Mhm.
and that's when I took the oath, and was officially enlisted. And then they flew me to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas, for 7 weeks of basic training. Uh, and then on to tech school. And that was at Chanute Air Force Base in Rantoul, Illinois. It was the schedule was for several months.
Mhm.
Um, and then from Rantoul, from Chanute, uh, I got my first what was called a permanent duty assignment. And that was to Richards Gabbard Air Force Base outside of Kansas City, Missouri. Um,
What was the first permanent duty assignment?
Permanent assignment.
Yeah.
This is when you get your first job
Uh-huh.
after basic training and after tech school. The first permanent assignment was in the security police,
Okay.
uh, and the whole base was really a restricted area with different layers of restrictions and security. Um, and what that base was about, the mission of that base, was to have aircraft, small jets, jets. Um, and so the highest level of security was really at the flight line, you know, where the planes were maintained and kept and stored and all of that. Um, and a weapons workshop, and storage area, the weapons for the planes. Those were the two areas of that base that had the highest security levels. Uh, and I think I'd like to point out, Jillian, that in comparing, I'm going to talk about the Air Force Security Police because that's what I know. Uh, Comparing that to law enforcement, so that comparison happens. In the security police, um, if someone did not comply with getting checked out and verified before entering a restricted area,
Mhm.
we did not try to arrest that person. We weren't. That wasn't our orders. The orders were to give a real firm command to stop. And if they did not comply with that, then the orders were to shoot them dead.
Mm. Wow.
So it was not law enforcement. Okay.
That was, well, and that is, so just some context. Are we talking about 1963? Is that,
Right.
so this is
Actually,
not long. Yeah,
by the
this
time
is
I,
not long after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And
oh yeah, Jill, in '62 we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? I was a senior in high school. Um, very, I was very intense about current events and also about learning history, studying history. Um, and so we had just finished, in October of '62, we had gone through the Cuban Missile Crisis. Um, and one of your questions was about a truly significant um, event while I was in the Air Force. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just before I was in the Air Force. And then the next fall, in next November, we had the assassination of President Kennedy. I was in the Air Force then less than 6 months, and our senior non-commissioned officers and other people with a lot of experience, they were convinced that the assassination was the Russians were involved in that assassination, and that it was already an act of war. The assassination itself was an act of war on the part of Russia. And our more experienced people were convinced that we were at war. Uh, you know, what had been a Cold War was about to turn hot.
mm,
And, I'm a young guy, I'm only a few months in the Air Force, only 18 years old. Um, but that was a pretty strong dose of reality.
I bet. And, you know, it, you will eventually be, you'll go from, it was in Missouri, correct?
I'm sorry.
To that base was in Missouri, correct?
Uh, our second base was in Illinois.
Oh, Illinois.
Uh,
Now, could you tell us a little bit about how you made your way to Alaska?
oh, okay, sure. I had been in Missouri at Richard Bar for about a year, um, and one of my goals, besides more education, was to what my 17-year-old self called to see the world. And he was my 17-year-old self was referring to the external world, the outside. And so I had been in Missouri for a year, and none of us that were young troops, were getting to go anywhere, to transfer anywhere. So I told my buddies, I'm going to volunteer. I'm going to go to personnel and I'm going to volunteer to go overseas. And I listed first choice, Germany, second choice, Germany, third choice, Germany, as if I had a choice, right?
Right.
So, so about a month later, I get orders to go to Clear Air Force Station in Alaska. And my buddies just had a field day with me, Jillian. We told you not to go volunteer. We told you. Now look at what you've done. So but listen, but I was enthused. I mean, I didn't know anything about Clear Air Force Station at the time, but I really intensely wanted to be somewhere. I wanted to go somewhere else. Uh, and Alaska sounded like a good place for me to go to. Um, but Jillian, before I was able to even leave Missouri to go home on leave, those same buddies who had been laughing at me started getting orders to go to Vietnam.
Mm.
And the laughing stopped, and they wanted to trade orders with me. They wanted to trade assignments with me. And of course, I didn't even talk to the Air Force about trading, because from my perspective, that was a done deal. I was going to go home on leave before I went to Alaska, and then Alaska was a 12-month remote assignment. Remote meaning there were no family members, provided for. Um, it was physically isolated. The beautiful picture of Clear, um, 90 miles out of Fairbanks, if you can imagine that. And Fairbanks was a few thousand people.
Mhm.
And then there was a major river between us and Fairbanks. And twice during the year, we couldn't even get across the river. So, I mean, isolation is the right word.
It sounds
Uh,
like it.
and that's why it was only a 12-month assignment.
Right.
But in my orientation at Clear, I was informed, that um, when you finish your 12 months here, if you have less than 8 months remaining of active duty time, on the first 4 years, um, it's the Air Force feels that it's better, it's more productive for everybody, for the Air Force to release you from active duty instead of reassigning you somewhere else for 8 or less months, or 8 or months or a shorter time. So I sat down with a calendar and I calculated if I extend here at Clear for an extra 4 months, um, the Air Force will allow me to go back home 8 months early, and I won't have to go to another assignment, and I will keep my maximum educational benefits. So I applied for the extension to stay at Clear an extra 4 months.
Wow.
And that was another time that people called me a fool, you know,
Well,
because people were eager to finish their 12 months.
well,
And here's this cat who's volunteering to do an extra 4.
well,
You know,
and can you just tell us a little bit about what it was for? What I mean, I've got some photos up here. I think that would be about the time you were there. What was the purpose in having? Because this wasn't a base, this was a station, correct?
right, right, and that only refers to the size of the population, the military population. That's really what it refers to, Jillian. It was 125 of us in the Air Force, divided between the radar techs and security police. You know, basically two groups of Air Force people. But there were also 500 civilian employees who worked for the contract company that had the contract at that time. And so it was, listen, Jillian, I'm a farm boy. So small places, small numbers of people are not a problem for me. Uh, the ones who had the hardest time with Clear, with the 12 months of isolation, were the big city boys, because when they wanted to party, there were no pretty girls. Okay,
They were on their own.
there were, there were, you know, they could do things, but wherever they went, there were no pretty girls to party with. Uh, um, but Jillian, for me, there was so much going on for me at Clear. Uh, it turned out to be my favorite assignment. It really was, for a variety of reasons.
And it sounds like, yeah, and it sounds like you were able to leave, but you still got your, was it 36 months education?
Absolutely.
So you
Right.
got that.
Right.
Um, could you tell us a little bit though, because there's I think you mentioned it, but maybe it starts with an S, but there's an actual term for that isolation that people can experience in remote places
Uh,
like
right. Right. It was caused, what you refer, well, the big city boys had a problem with the isolation. Okay.
that.
But that was a social problem. Um, but the extreme darkness, and we're talking about pitch black at 11:30 in the morning, and then a condition that I would call twilight or dusk, and then by 12:30 in the afternoon, it was pitch black again. You know, and that condition, Jillian, causes some people to become severely depressed.
Mhm.
The lack of light, the lack of sunlight. And those people, the Air Force people who experienced that, had to be reassigned elsewhere. Uh,
Well, Gil, you're still doing policing,
I'm
correct?
sorry.
Are you still policing at Clear Air Station? You're still doing guard policing. Is that
Uh,
your assignment?
I'm still in the security police, right?
Security
It's
police. I'm sorry.
right.
Well, could you just tell me what would a typical day with a schedule like that be
Oh, wow,
with the
wow.
light that way? Just you can just give me like a little quick. This would be the typical day for you while you were there. That would be great.
Well, it's the schedule is a recipe. It's a formula for aging you very quickly. Okay, um, because we work three shifts in 3 days for the same shift for 3 days, or 3 nights, or three graveyards. Okay, and the graveyard shift is appropriately named. It really is. Because if you can visualize being on duty from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m.,
Hmm.
I mean, you can't close your eyes, you can't blink. It's on duty, um, and then trying to sleep in the daytime. What would be daytime?
Yeah.
And the frequency of changes. I mean, changing shifts every 3 days will just simply wear a person out. Um, so out of 14 days, we worked three of the three shifts. So there were four crews, four flight. We called them flights. Um, there were three flights working the three shifts, and there was one flight that was off. Okay. Um, the typical day at work was to get dressed and show up for our meeting on time. Um, was checking out a weapon, loading the weapon, going to your assignments, with the weapons. And for most shifts that I was at Clear, um, I was assigned to be the team leader of our mobile response team. We had a two-seater truck, and that's what we worked out of. Um, and our primary response was to respond. Our primary responsibility was to respond to wherever we were assigned to go to. As a mobile unit. Um, and so that's pretty typically was how the shift went. Um,
Well, for somebody who doesn't know what a ballistic missile early warning system is,
okay.
this was a really important place for that, correct?
It was everything that Clear was about. Um, and Clear, by the way, was one of three BMEWS sites. Okay. And probably the two missions that Clear had was to detect uh, incoming ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, being fired from Russia over towards any parts of Canada and the United States, any parts of the Atlantic Ocean, that whole area, and all the way to the east, including England, all of Europe, and the Scandinavian countries. So I think a good way to paint a picture of that system um, was to use an umbrella. Okay,
Mhm.
Clear was on the left hand side or the western side of this system, um, and we had those three big radar screens that you see in the picture here,
Mhm.
and the three screens overlapped so that there would be nothing missed in the sky. Uh, the radar site in the center was in Greenland, and they overlapped with our radar screens. And then the site, the base that was all the way on the east was in England, and they overlapped with Thule, Greenland. Okay, United States had smaller sites up and down the western and eastern coast for anything coming in from those two oceans. But the ballistic missile early warning system was primarily all about detecting Russian missiles being fired, and alerting or warning, issuing warning to our whole chain of command. And the chain of command, of course, reached all the way to the commander in chief. And the hope that everyone had, Jillian, was to keep the war a Cold War. That is, without those two nuclear powers using their weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And secondarily was to respond in case the other power fired weapons. And the response would have been wow. I thought about that a lot, Jillian, but the response was going to be an all-out atomic war.
Well, Gil, when you see these huge radar screens, is that what? How big would something have to be for these to detect it?
Wow. The screen that you're looking at in the center,
mm-hmm.
was built on top of a 20-foot high burn of gravel. And the surface area of each of those screens, each one, the surface area was 3 times the size of a football field.
Wow.
If you sat in the stadium and you looked down at a football field, imagine something on its side 3 times larger. And in the picture on the right, you can see a screen in the foreground, another one to the left, top left,
mm-hmm.
center left, and then a third one all the way in the top right. And you can see that each of those was at a different angle to cover the whole spectrum of the western part of that area. And I say the area, the western part of that population that BMEWS was all about protecting. We were hopeful that the best hope was that all of this radar and the nuclear weapons would deter the use of the weapons. That was the best hope that we had. And I have to tell you, Jillian, there were times during the Cold War when we came pretty close to a misunderstanding, a mishap, a misjudgment. All of those things came close to happening during the Cold War era.
Well, and that's an important lesson for people today as well, I think.
It's what?
We still have nuclear weapons in the world today. So it's important for people to remember the effort I think that you're describing here that went into deterring the use of those weapons.
Right. Well, Jillian, it stands to reason that if two nations with these weapons have a very complex situation to deal with, okay, that was the Cold War times, the United States and Russia. Imagine now there are 9 countries that are known to have nuclear weapons. Imagine the complexity of that.
Well, and something you mentioned to me too was that acronym MAD.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
It's in more ways than one, that acronym summarizes so much, because what the words stand for, if you isolate the 3 words, it is mutual or mutually assured destruction. Now, if you ponder those words individually and together,
mm-hmm.
It truly was mutually assured destruction. It truly was, potentially.
Potentially. Yeah.
Potentially.
So one of the questions I have, because being out in Alaska, were there any indigenous people or other towns nearby, or is this so isolated that that even was nothing,
Uh,
no one
about,
there?
about 20 miles away at the river, at the Tanana River, was a small town called Denali, Alaska.
Mhm.
And there were some native, native Indian, Native Alaskans who lived in that area. Um, on the base, Julian, we had the 500 civilian employees, and some of them actually had families living nearby, even a small school, because some of those families had school children. Um, I was always, when I was not at work for the Air Force, I was always trying to earn money and occupy myself part time. And in Alaska, one of the civilian employees had gotten a land grant, uh, right, not far from the base, okay, but from federal property, he was given a land grant. The condition was he had to build a house within 5 years. And so when I was not working for the Air Force, I was helping him build that house. Uh, it was heavy lifting. It really was, pouring cement or pushing a wheelbarrow full of wet cement.
Oh, wow.
Uh, it was tough, but I enjoyed it immensely. And when I couldn't do that kind of work, um, I was a waiter at the NCO club and restaurant, mostly the restaurant on base. Again, working only for tips. Okay,
Mhm.
so if you're working only for tips, you really have to deliver quality service. You just have to.
Well, Gil, it sounds like you made the most of your time in the Air Force. And so before we kind of move on to after the Air Force, is there anything else you want to share about your time in Alaska or any other anecdotes
Sure.
from your service?
I think uh, in Alaska, Jillian, there were lots of things that really were deeply satisfying to me. Um, but the three that come to mind, one is being able to watch the northern lights.
Mm,
Oh my goodness, uh, the a social benefit was that the people there, because of our isolation, because of the extreme conditions, weather conditions, light conditions, um, people were much closer to each other, looked out for each other, um, more than in a place or time that I had ever experienced, before Alaska or since Alaska. So for me, that was a huge social benefit. If you can imagine, Mount McKinley or Denali in the native language, Denali, the mighty one, was 104 miles away, and the thing is so big, so tall, and so wide that I could see it like it was across the street. Except the times that I couldn't see it were in those periods of extreme darkness. And the other occasion was in the 104 miles, there was an ice fog. And I'm talking about a fog where the air temperatures are so cold that the fog simply hangs. It hangs. It hangs for days until it warms up enough, to begin to melt that fog. Um, but Jillian, when I could see Mount McKinley again, the spiritual lesson for me was that there had been times in my life when I could not see God, okay, or a God. But the fact that that mountain was always there, even when I couldn't see it, uh, just reminded me that God is always there. And
it's
and
beautiful.
that spiritual lesson has been huge for me. It's been the most it's been probably the most encouraging, hopeful, uh, things in my life. It really has been. Um, that just like Mount McKinley, even when I couldn't see the mountain, I eventually saw it again, and it had been there the whole time.
Mm.
So, you know, I mean, there are many takeaways for me from being in Alaska, but I think those are three of the top things. You know.
Well, you went into the service because you wanted the benefit of going to college. So
Right.
could you tell us a little bit about leaving the service and just your journey afterwards, your in education and
Right.
where did
Right.
that take you?
Well, I think, kind of a footnote that's necessary here, Jillian. At the time, in 1966, when I was finishing in Alaska, um, being on active duty and pursuing an education, the technology was not available for us to do that. So I made the hard choice. It was a hard choice to leave active duty to pursue the education. Uh, and I did that. I went back home, registered, and got through school as quickly as I could. Okay. Um, 12-hour summers, two of those, and 21-hour semesters, two of those every calendar year. Um, and I was not expecting this knock on the door, but as I'm finishing a degree in management, and at the time, management was very marketable
Mhm.
because employers were beginning to recognize now we can hire professionally trained managers, who have that particular specialized training. Um, and so, in my last few weeks of my last semester, and so I go to the door, and there are two Air Force recruiters there. I said, "What do you guys want with me? I'm even honorable discharge by now. What are you looking for me? Oh man, can we sit down? Have we got something for you?" So I said, "Okay, well, listen, I know what you're about. I mean, I know what you are and I know what you do. You recruit for the Air Force. So give me your very best sales pitch." so, so their answer was, as soon as you finish this degree requirement um, and you give us proper uh, documentation, we are going to get you into a 12-week officer training school. And at the end of that, you will be a commissioned officer in the Air Force. And with your background, with your resume, with this degree, your career will be like a rocket. And so I said, "Well, guys, I'm married now and I have a child, so uh, there needs to be a serious discussion here in this house, and I'll get back with you." Uh, but my wife at the time chose, I mean, her choice was that I would not uh, do a career in the Air Force. And so we went in other directions. I went to work for a major oil company that was located right there. But you know what, Jillian? Major oil companies transfer people more than the Air Force did.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I
They-
should have paid more attention because my first supervisor with the oil company had started there his career and had been in 9 locations in 20 years.
Wow.
They, it's a strange industry, but they wanted people who would be loyal to the company.
Mhm.
They would pay you during the bust times of the oil industry, but what you had to give them was loyalty. And the way that they announced their promotion, and they did it to me. 3 years later, they were doing it to me. We want to promote you, Gil, but your next paycheck will be at, and they named the place that it was going to be at.
And then you had to be there to get it.
So,
Yeah, that is funny. Well, and let me ask you this because going into management, I've talked to many people, known people in the military who have said that they learned a lot about management in the military.
sure,
So did
sure.
you find having that experience in the military to be very beneficial in your
Oh, absolutely,
choice of
Jillian.
career and
I mean, listen, mom and daddy had, my basic training started the first day of my life, really, uh, because mom and daddy were teaching me those values and those behaviors, and those ways of thinking. Um, Long before I went to basic training for the Air Force. But the combination, Jillian, the combination of that kind of childhood growing up and the Air Force experience and then the management degree, yeah, I mean, uh, can I share a funny example for basic training with you uh,
absolutely.
that will make the point? There were 70 of us in that basic training group, in one large open bay area, open bay meaning there were no interior walls. Uh, Bunks were lined up, in rows and all of that. So we had three drill instructors, and two of them were in their second enlistment. Um, and one of them in particular, in his favorite way of correcting a recruit who was not doing things correctly, was to get right up in the guy's face and scream, "Your mama is not here. It's you and it's me. How are you and I going to straighten this out? Are we going to straighten this out?" And Jillian, that was his way of making the point that, your mama's not here to fix this problems. You know, you need to fix it. You need to figure out, I've told you what you need to do correctly.
Hmm.
You need to make up your mind about it, okay? Um, and, the military has funny ways of accomplishing goals. They really do. But his point was to the recruit when he did that to someone, it was to remind us that you've got to shape up, you've got to do things correctly, you've got to do all of those things. Um, and in fact, Jillian, out of that 70 people, the Air Force finally decided there was one individual who was not adaptable, and they sent him home, with an honorable discharge. I mean, it wasn't his behaviors. The Air Force decided he did not have the capabilities, the capacity, to perform. And so, one thing, I said there are lots of things that help people to develop, but in fact, Jillian, I can honestly say my readjusting back to being a civilian was challenging at times. It was challenging. Um, and I understand that one reason for that is because I had gotten used to in the Air Force where competency rules the day.
Hmm.
And that's not the case in civilian life. It was not the case in 66, and it's not the case now. Um, and so for me, and I think for lots of other veterans, that adjustment back to civilian life has challenges. Um, because you get used to being able to depend on people to do things correctly.
Right. And if they don't do them correctly the first time, they keep working on it until they get it right.
Well, in the military, in the military, there's not a lot of slack, but you don't have a lot of time
Right.
to get it right. So,
I think that's a really important point, though, and I'm glad you made it because that is, there's certainly, it's a similar thing I've heard from other people. There's the structure too of the military, knowing that everybody's going to show up, do their job, being
right.
duty driven is something that, yeah,
And I think, Jillian, the bottom line of all of that is because in the military, there are immediate consequences. You know,
Yeah.
In civilian life, not always true.
Well, um, and even in you, being in a remote place like Alaska, something that I meant to ask you too is what was the communication like? Were you able to contact your family on a pretty regular basis? Or is that, you know,
Yeah, we had. Yeah, I mean, listen, the resources for me were wonderful. I mean, I was um, in addition to my contract labor work and being a waiter at the club, I
mhm.
also developed a small retail business, a catalog.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. Our retail store, okay, was obviously pretty small. They could not stock everything. They couldn't even get everything that people wanted. Um, so I developed a retail catalog sales business. Um, the opportunity was there. The demand was there, Jillian.
Yeah. And you had, you know, you made all the use of your extra time, it sounds like, you know,
Yeah, right.
because, a lot of bases, as you mentioned, like the city boys who came, they were looking for a city to go to and blow off steam and stuff. But you really found a
Uh,
way to make the most of that smaller environment, Gil. That's really neat. I do, you talked a lot about like the Cold War, um, and
sure.
and that what was going on at the time. And, you are there at a time when things do start to escalate a little bit in Vietnam. Was there any, did any of that impact where you were in Alaska, or is that something that just
Uh,
seemed
Jillian, it
separate?
it really affected, by that time, Jill, pretty quickly when I got to Alaska, within a short period of time, uh, I had made my plans and I had gotten Air Force approval on my doing the extra 4 months, okay, and then going home. So the prospect of going to Vietnam, was not a real big issue for me personally. But for the younger guys who had another assignment coming up after Alaska, or for the lifers, career people, uh, they had the possibility of going to Vietnam. Sure, sure. Um, and honestly, I can't remember. I can't remember us talking about that very much, Jillian. But everybody knew that for most people, it was a possibility. Um,
Well, Gail,
um,
in conversations with you, um I know that serving is so many have, and doing so in an honorable way, it means so much. And it's your service, it's what you sacrifice, but in the Cold War, it's also what you were willing to sacrifice. Um, because, I'm guessing if there had been some sort of nuclear war, even being in Alaska, you would not have been safe as
right,
if those
right.
things had played. So I do want to talk a little bit about just reflections and legacy. Um, One thing I do want to ask you though, because you served in the 60s, and you also were, it sounds like it's probably still working your career when the Soviet Union collapsed. Um,
Um,
what were when that happened, when the Berlin Wall fell and then eventually the Soviet states started to leave the Union, do you have any reflections just overall of the end of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union to share?
well, Jillian, really, my take on that is that war, conflict, drama, violence is our default condition. Okay? It is our default condition of humanity. Peace and tranquility are not our default conditions. It's not what we normally have. And so that's why keeping the war cold
Mhm.
was such an important goal. It was everything. It was our only hope. You was to create and uh, to take care of the things that would be a deterrent to the war going hot. Because the war going hot was a I don't even want to think about that.
Right. Well,
And so every effort, everything we did was to keep the war cold. Not easy, not easy, and especially these days, it's even more complicated, politically and diplomatically and so forth.
well, in keeping up with politics, were you surprised that the Soviet Union collapsed when it did? Or
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm not. I was not surprised, Jillian, because their system, the communist system, is not built for longevity. You know, when you have to force people to do those things that they force people to do, that's not sustainable. There will be a time when people rebel against that system simply because it doesn't provide enough individual freedom. And so, the answer to your question, I was not surprised because that sort of a system has a very limited lifespan.
it does. And the 20th century saw that play out in several places. So one of the things that I want to bring up is because you do have some artifacts, and there's several things that you shared with, and I know one of the things that you're very, very proud of that I have here on the screen is the quilt of honor. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, Jillian, in the center image is called a quilt of valor.
Mhm.
Um, this one was made by a particular volunteer quilter. And in the national organization, there are 15,000 people that are quilters who volunteer to create these gifts for veterans. And now the good news is also for people on active duty as well. Um, as of today, that national group of individual quilters has created and given over 400,000 quilts. And it
Wow.
is such a gift. I mean, mine is such a gift to me. Um, the nomination process is simple. You get on their website, quiltsofvalor.org. Anyone can nominate a veteran or an active duty member. Veterans nominate each other, and I have done that. And my being at a presentation when someone else got their quilt was as big a moment for me as getting my own. It's such a gift, and their focus, the organization's of quilters' focus, is to wrap the veteran or the active duty member in a gift of healing and warmth. The quilt because of the warmth.
Mhm.
And part of the presentation is to physically, you can see it on the right-hand side, is to wrap the veteran in the quilt during the presentation. Um, on the left-hand side, um, in the bottom image, is a national certificate and a letter from the national chairperson and the local quilters group leader. That's who signs that letter. Um, on the right-hand side, one of the things that you see there in the center is a label that the quilter creates. It's on the back side of the quilt, but it has the name, date of service, and the branch of service. Um, um, so those keepsakes I mean, they speak to me so clearly that when I nominated myself and a neighbor who was 10 years older
Mm.
than me, um, when I nominated myself and I had phone contact with the local leader, I asked them to add to the back of the quilt uh, uh, some pieces of fabric that I could hang it up like this, like you see here.
Yeah.
I've always had it. I've always had it ever since the beginning. I've had it displayed like you see in this picture. Yeah.
Well, it's so beautiful, and quilts are just hanging them on the wall is always a great thing to do to really show
So I
work.
want to be able to see it constantly.
Yeah.
That's my dining room wall. Um, and my living room is just a few feet off to the side of that. Um, I see it all the time, and I want to see it all the time. Um, Listen, people walk into my front door, and their feet just start moving towards the quilt.
It would be hard not to. It just
They
it's
just
so
they,
beautiful. It just stands out so much.
they just have to. And so I'm encouraging our audience members and whoever that is
Mhm.
to please look into nominating someone.
Built to valor and
Or,
this.
or yourself. If you're a veteran or an active duty member, you could nominate yourself easily.
I love this. And did you say it's all volunteers that do this? The quilt.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
Right.
That's an amazing thing to do. Times spent.
Oh, Jillian, it's fun. I mean, because listen, my mother quilted,
Mhm.
and so I know from my own childhood what goes into making a quilt. I mean, listen, there's hundreds of pieces in this quilt, pieces of fabric, um, and it's an absolute gift. I mean, I nominated myself to receive one, but nobody asked me to pay for it. Nobody said, "What else do you need? Is there something else you need to do?" There was nothing else I needed to do, Jillian, except give them the basic information. And in a period of a few weeks, um, the lead of the group called me and said, "We can reschedule your presentation."
I really hope that there are people who watch this who now go in to the
Um,
website and nominate themselves or other people. That would be, I think they will. Um, Gil, you
Jillian, I
all
mean,
go
there
ahead.
probably are millions of people that are eligible to have to receive it. I'm sure.
Sure. Especially that they're doing active service people.
Oh yeah, right.
Well, so you also mentioned something about a medal in a previous conversation.
Right.
Um,
I have it here.
Great. Tell
Uh,
us about it.
can you see it, Jillian?
Let me see. Yes. Yeah, we can see it. It looks
It's called the National Defense Medal, National Defense Service Medal. And there's something else, Jillian, that we want to encourage veterans and active duty people to pursue getting this. Here's what happened. I wrote to the military personnel records people in St. Louis asking for whatever documents of mine, that they could copy and send to me. I never knew about the medal. I never knew that. Naturally, I never knew that I was eligible for it. So I didn't ask for it. The person who processed my request in St. Louis noticed that I was eligible for it and had never received it. So in comes this package of mail. And not only are my documents in the package, but so is this medal. It's called the National Defense Service Medal. Um,
it.
and here's who is eligible. Okay.
Okay.
Um, Starting with the current period, uh, people who have served in the global war on terrorism, which the eligibility period is 2001 to the present. So anybody on active duty, who meets the requirements, uh, is eligible for it. Going backward an area, the Gulf War people, 1990, who served 1990 to 95. Going back to my eligibility is the Vietnam War era, 1961 to 74. And then for the Korean War veterans who are still living, 1950 to 1954. And so I had an experience with a neighbor not too long ago. She walks in, heads towards the quilt of Valor, And off to the right-hand side of the quilt, I have this medal on the wall. And so we talk about the quilt, and she wants to know about the medal. I said, well, you need to understand the military has different classifications of awards and medals and so forth. There's one classification that people know about, and that's the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart medals for heroic actions above and beyond the call of duty. Okay, above and beyond. I said, I want you to understand. I told her, I said, this medal is not for anything heroic. She said, well, how did you get it? I said, I did my job, I did it well, and I came home. That's it. I did my job during one of those eras, but that's how I qualified for it. And I don't think that's heroic, compared to that other classification of medals. And she stood back and she says, well, it's heroic to me. I said, okay. I guess what is heroic is a matter of opinion, baby, huh? But she considered, in her mind, doing my job and doing it well and coming home was heroic. It is heroic.
Well, and you played a part, Gil, in keeping that war cold, which, that is very heroic, and humanity should be grateful for that. It just looking back, just a couple of last things here I have for you, and feel free to add, but when you look at different achievements and moments of pride that stand out to you for your military service, is there anything that you want to add that we haven't already talked about?
Concerning my active duty service, Jillian, is that what
Well, and maybe just something taking away from the military training and experience. Is there anything we haven't really covered that,
Oh,
you know? And feel free to include anything that's humorous.
okay.
You know, I know
Listen,
you've got a great sense of humor.
here's what I think is a great wrap up in response to your question.
Mhm.
It was my 17-year-old self who made the decision to enlist. Okay. Now, in looking back, more than 60 years, because I just turned 80 last month, that 17-year-old self made a brilliant decision. Brilliant. I mean, it was just, he did a number on that decision. He did. Um, Everything, Jillian, that I experienced on active duty, everything since then has reaffirmed that decision was the right thing for me to do. The right thing for lots of parties, for me, hopefully for the country, for people who love freedom, um, because freedom is not free. Someone has to pay. Someone has to pay. And we have enough oppression worldwide, to be able to see that freedom is not free. That 17-year-old self made some bad decisions too, but this one was A1. A1. Unless you have more questions, Jillian, I'd like to finish with a reading.
I think that's a wonderful way to wrap this up.
Okay. Um, this one is a gift was a gift to me. I'll read it. Um, it was a gift to me here in Arkansas from neighbors. And if you go to the internet and images, and you type in the final inspection, you'll get a multitude of choices of images. Um, the neighbors chose this one to print for me because it has a Department of Air Force insignia on it. Okay. Now, the author is unknown, but in my mind, and I have it right here on the wall, when I swivel my chair away from the computer, I am eyeball to eyeball with this reading uh, because it is that meaningful to me. That's why, and that's why I'm sharing it. Um, Veterans and active duty people know all about military inspections. Okay, all about it. This one is entitled "The Final Inspection." The soldier stood and faced God, which must always come to pass. He hoped his shoes were shining just as brightly as his brass. Step forward now, you soldier. How should I deal with you? Have you always turned the other cheek? To my church have you been true? The soldier squared his shoulders and said, No, Lord, I guess I ain't. Because those of us who carry guns can't always be a saint. I've had to work most Sundays, and at times my talk was tough. But sometimes I've been violent because the world is awfully tough. But I never took a penny that wasn't mine to keep, though I worked a lot of overtime when the bills got too steep. I never passed a cry for help, though at times I shook with fear. And sometimes, God, forgive me, I've wept unmanly tears. I know I don't deserve a place among the people here. They never wanted me around except to calm their fears. If you have a place for me here, Lord, it needn't be so grand. I never expected or had too much. So if you don't, I'll understand. There was silence all around the throne where the saints had often trod as the soldier waited quietly for the judgment of his God. Step forward now, you soldier. You've borne your burdens well. Walk peacefully on heaven's street. You've done your time in hell.